Welcome back to Sustainability Mindshift, where we are exploring what it takes to be a sustainability leader today, including the skills and the capabilities and specifically the mindsets that are critical for success. I'm your host, Brad Pierce, and I am very lucky to have Michelle Holliday here with us today. Hi, Michelle.
Hi, Brad. Great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for being here on the show with us. I am going to quickly let the listeners know a little bit about you. Michelle is a pioneer whose work is centered around thrivability, which is a set of beliefs, intentions, and practices based on a view of organizations as living systems. We're going to be talking about that today. She's dedicated the past 2 decades to helping steward change for people and organizations, helping them understand what it takes for life to thrive and why that matters. She's a strategist, facilitator, speaker, researcher, and author of an important book, which I have here with me today, called The Age of Thrivability, Vital Perspectives and Practices for a Better World. That was published in 2016. This book is a comprehensive guide to the transition humanity is undergoing. More importantly, it outlines a straightforward framework for enabling life to thrive along the way, using real-life stories to show how viewing businesses and communities through this lens reveals tremendous new possibilities for success and sustainability. A couple other things about Michelle. She serves as a host to many communities of practice and public conversations and workshops where she brings people together to help them navigate complexity, discover ways they can feel more alive, connect more meaningfully with each other, and serve life more powerfully through their work. So I'm just going to end that little bit with a quote about the book. Only by aligning with life in the spirit of learning, compassion, contribution, and play can we find the motivation and the means to collaborate and innovate at the levels required. That's from her book, The Age of Thrivability. I love that last quote because it includes play, which is, as you know, I'm a big fan of play and games and simulations, experiential learning.
That's it. That's it. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And I want to mention that I'm joining you, as you know, Brad, from my cottage in the countryside, about 90 minutes north of Montreal. And I mention that because I have dogs here with me who might bark, and it'll be okay. We'll get through it. But if it's disruptive for a moment, I'll mute myself, and Brad, you can riff and add your comments. But
this is real life here, folks. That's right.
It is, exactly.
Thanks for joining us. Yeah, let's get started. I'd love for you to talk about. I'm a big fan of your book and your work. As I mentioned, you've been doing this for a couple of decades now, which is why I consider you a pioneer in this space, looking at living systems. And I loved the beginning of the book talks about how we have evolved as human beings from the beginning of time. I always felt that when I was a kid. I thought, it seems to me that human beings seem to be evolving just as we do as humans, going through a stage of childlike behaviors and actions into some sort of teenage years and into more adult. So tell us about that and your work around that.
All right. So I started on this journey almost exactly 20 years ago. I had been working in big multinational corporations for a few years and had the sense that something really important was missing in how we think about work. And I was in marketing and brand strategy. So specifically, I had the sense that we were missing something in how we engage customers and community, what that relationship is supposed to be. I moved into employee engagement, leadership development, and organizational culture. And again, thought we're missing something really important in how we think about the relationships we have inside of organizations. And my instinct was that it had something to do with the overall guiding story we have, the worldview or paradigm about how the world works, including how organizations work and economies and communities. And I wanted to understand how do we get the story that we have now that continues to be dominant, that seems to tell us that everything operates like a machine, especially our organizations, but also us and our communities. And what if there's more to the story? Isn't there also life in that work in organizational culture and leadership development? We would talk about the human spirit and people would say, our clients would say, we're not interested in that. The human spirit doesn't have a place here in business. Try the nonprofits. They're into that kind of thing. But the nonprofits were trying to become more business-like, so they weren't interested either. And I thought, how does that make sense that the human spirit doesn't have a place? And what do I mean by the human spirit anyway? So I went in search of the rest of the story. I had an opportunity to do independent research for a year and a half and studied biology. My intuition was it had something to do with life and aliveness. And so I researched living systems. What does it take for anything that's alive to thrive? And I went deeper into my understanding of organizations. What does it take for an organization to thrive? Is there anything common across those two? And as you know, there's complete connection between the two. We can recognize our organizations and economies and communities as living systems. And this is a huge shift in worldview. And I'm not the only one who's noticing it. It's been wonderful over the 20 years to see how many more people are starting to use language of aliveness, moving from re-engineering the organization to recognizing business ecosystems and resilience and creativity. Those concepts don't actually make any sense in a mechanistic story. So in our organizations, we see evidence of this shift in consciousness or worldview, but we see it in every sphere of society. And it's absolutely necessary. It's also not guaranteed that we're going to make it all the way into a new era and a new worldview as the dominant story. That mechanistic story continues to have a strong pull and a sort of a temper tantrum of resistance, not wanting to give up.
Yeah. Well, tell us about, so how did we get here? Walk us through the evolution of humanity, and if you will. I know it's a longer story and people should read your book to learn more about it, but give us a little synopsis.
I love that on a podcast. So walk us through the evolution of humanity. But I'll do my best in very brief form. And do you mean kind of the eras of humanity that might lead to? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So in my research, those 20 years ago, I noticed that across all living systems, wherever we look, including our organizations, there are 4 conditions that are always present that need to be cultivated if we are to support any living system in its ability to thrive. And I found that those are also present for all of humanity, as if we are one massive superorganism, also evolving and growing in our capacity to thrive, to be ever more resilient and adaptive and creative. So just really quickly, those 4 patterns or conditions are that there are diverse parts. The parts are connected and supported in patterns and structures of relationship in a way that enables the emergence of a new whole. And all of that is self-integrating, self-organizing, self-healing, self-managing, self-generating, self-regenerating. So parts, relationship, whole, and life. It's life really that powers all of that in its self-organization and self-integration. So what I was astounded to notice is that the major eras of humanity follow those patterns pretty exactly. So in the hunter-gatherer era, we see evidence of a consciousness, of a way of understanding the world that's rooted in wholeness. And we see it in infancy as well, that we have no awareness of separation, only of our inherent fundamental wholeness. There's a present moment awareness and sort of a oneness with all life. And so we see examples of every hunter-gatherer society has rituals that tune us in, drumming and dance and psychedelic substances that are helping us to really tap into the fundamental wholeness. And then in the agricultural era, we see that the consciousness shifted into one of relationship, of awareness, of our ability to be in relationship with the land and with each other. And so this is when we saw the appearance of civilization, aspects of civilization like architecture and mathematics and language and religion and the hierarchies of relationship that we see in more complex society. And then in the industrial era, when really we can go back to the modern era with the ancient Greeks, we see the emergence of a worldview of separateness, of parts, in which individual rights were fathomable. They weren't something even that could be comprehended in the earlier eras, but now we can hold the concept of democracy and of the scientific method, breaking things down into their individual parts to understand them and analyze them. And we've taken it to its extreme. I think there's value. I think life wants diversity. And so I think this has been somehow life's grand experiment to see how much more resilience and adaptability and creativity we can generate with this awareness of our distinctiveness and separateness and the parts within the whole. And now it's time for us to move into an era of wisdom in which we integrate all of those patterns together and we align with life at a deeper level. So that's the age of thrivability that I point to. That's here, just not evenly distributed, right?
I like how you say that it's also, it's important that all of those pieces, as you've outlined, are carried forward, because I think I'm sure a lot of us, as I do, feel like if we've lost our way, we need to come back from something, or leave something and move into something completely new. As opposed to, I think what you're saying is, all those four parts are inherently part of nature and
Exactly.
going to be there. There's no way to escape from them. But that this next stage of evolution is to have a higher level of consciousness about all of it and how it's all interconnected.
Right.
And
Right. I have a phrase in the book that they are different faces of wisdom. And in our mechanistic worldview, we dismiss hunter-gatherer consciousness as naive and magical and wrong. And now we're starting to discover that Indigenous cultures and with their deep rootedness and historical context have such foundational wisdom, such complexity, such rootedness in context that we weren't able to see from that industrial and divergent reductionist worldview. So thank goodness we're starting to be able to recognize and honor it. And now we have to figure out how do we not just go back, but go forward, integrating those different phases of wisdom.
It is nice to see the growing, I think, awareness of the importance of Indigenous wisdoms and knowledge starting to pop up everywhere. It could be just me and you and our circles that we're in, but I do feel like
No, in fact, I have a nice little story. I taught along with a colleague, Anna Pollock, last year, an 11-week course in regenerative tourism. I use regenerative and thrivable somewhat interchangeably. So we were teaching this course to over 100 people from across New Zealand, and many of them were Maori, were Indigenous. And I remember speaking with one young woman who said she had left New Zealand for 15 years and just recently returned. And she's Maori, and she said in that 15 years, everything changed. And when she left, it was shameful to be Maori. It was something to be ashamed of. When she came back, it was sort of all the rage. But suddenly you were held up as a person of wisdom and substance. And she was struggling to adjust, and even to adjust her own understanding of her identity and who she was. But that really encouraged me that in her short experience of those 15 years, there was a dramatic shift.
Yeah, that's wonderful to hear. Absolutely. Those Indigenous populations deserve that kind of respect, and so much wisdom in that and in nature as you find through your work and you apply it. So tell us more about how you apply these living systems and wisdom from nature and even Indigenous populations into the work that you're doing. I know you've done work with tourism. You can mention some of that or other examples.
Yes. So I work with individual organizations, and more I work with sectors or regions. I found that it's really difficult to make this transition as an individual person. It's even difficult to make it as an individual organization. We seem to need others to find the courage and the multiple perspectives, I think, about context, the context that we're in and that we're serving. So I work with national and regional tourism organizations to bring different stakeholders together, like government organizations that are dedicated to supporting the tourism sector, but also individual operators and citizens and sort of partner organizations, so that together they can explore what more is needed and how do we shift our thinking and therefore our actions. So in one small example, the language of tourism, and already the word tourism is somewhat problematic, but the language there is that these national and regional organizations have the mandate of managing the tourist destination. And what we explore together is what shifts when we instead see the mandate as cultivating the host community. It's a very different thing. Some of the same activities will take place, but much more comes into view, and including the possible role and skills that we need of hosting and cultivating together as a community. So I have sort of parallel work in agriculture. I'm sure that we're needing to shift from an industrial reductionist mechanistic approach to how we grow food and tend the land or manage the land, to one in which we partner with the living soil in regenerative approaches to agriculture. And it's not as simple and straightforward as just knowing the science, knowing the handful of methods that are involved. There's a whole shift in worldview and in how we understand our role. And farmers need the support of a learning community with other farmers, but also with their bankers and insurance companies that will only insure the old ways of farming, for example, or lending for the old ways of farming, and consumers or eaters, So I work with regional groups to be in learning and conversation together and more.
Yeah. It's interesting because, I love the ecosystemic approach that you're talking about. It's not just about, because I think a lot of ecotourism, which actually I have a graduate degree in that, and a lot of it at the time in the late 90s talked about, protecting the nature and a little bit about the culture. But it seems to be there's a shift there now, in addition to, minimizing your impact on nature, for example, is to not just minimize your negative impact on the culture, but actually use the power of tourism to help, as you said, I think nurture, regenerate the culture and the community. That is really why a lot of people go to places, not just for the natural setting.
It's true. It's surprising to me how provocative and controversial it is for me to point out that the word regeneration is a synonym for healing. That the term regenerative has become trendy and popular, and it's thrown around more and more. I'm in the regenerative space. I hear, and I think, what does that mean for you? So it's good. It's a good thing. And I like to point out that it really means healing. It's about any living system's inherent ability to continuously heal itself and generate new possibilities. And so linked to that is the need for wisdom to see anything from multiple perspectives. So these two words, healing and wisdom, are just kind of radical and and dangerous, and yet exactly what's needed. So in our approaches to tourism, there's an opportunity to have deeper conversations than just the tactical. How do we do slightly less harm in these specific ways to ask, what would it really mean for us to be a force for regeneration, a vector for healing of people and place? What are the conversations we can have here and host each other and host the life that's in this place, so that people will be drawn to that conversation? If that's also the conversation that they're wanting to have, they can join us, bring their voices in, and maybe be healed and bring some of that back to their place.
I love that. Yeah. And interestingly, you mentioned too, the sort of the regenerative aspect of co-creation. And I've heard that used a lot too, and how nature, everything it does is to in support of life, right? To co-create and bring new life into existence. And so that's a good story that you have here, where you talk about going into a community and having them use their wisdom to co-create a whole new future. I love that. You mentioned that in the last call that we had, envisioning, reimagining what tourism looks like, or what, success or happiness looks like in that place, and then designing from that point, as opposed to often, as we do, starting from a dollar figure. How much can we make out of this, how many people can we bring, how we maximize yield here to
Right.
to squeeze the most out of this place, as opposed to the other way around.
Right. We seem to start from tactics and technologies most often, and that's what the mechanistic story told us was the right thing to do, but that's not a wise way, and therefore not likely to lead to healing, and in fact is likely to have violence kind of woven into it. It's not a coincidence there's this kind of excitement around disruptive technology, that's a violent thing. What else, what's the wise thing that can bring the most healing? Yeah.
And how do you work with either, using the same example of tourism or business or even leaders? You've got these 4 principles, as I wrote down. You call them
life's universal design principles.
Yeah, I love that. Do you find yourself, working with organizations and leaders and sort of taking them through a step-by-step journey through the 4 principles, helping them understand them and working to evolve themselves through that? Or do you find that you can kind of plug and play different principles, or how do you use them?
Really good. So I'm always learning. So I might answer that, sort of, here's what I've done in the past, here's what I've been experimenting with, here's what I'm really excited to try next. So those design principles are just always useful in whatever configuration we explore them. So we can ask, what would it look like if each of us as parts in this ecosystem is able to contribute what is needed of us and what is nourishing to us? What will that look like? And let's have that conversation together. What will it look like when the relationship, the structure, infrastructure, and patterns of relationship, when there's flow and information is shared easily, there's trust. So I talk about that as designing for flow. Inviting divergence is the conversation around us each as parts. And then designing for flow. For wholeness, I talk about that as sensing convergence. So what is calling to us, not what is your calling, like your job description. People show up, this is my calling. And this is the bigger question of context and wisdom and need. So what is the purpose that calls to us, the call for that wisdom and healing that are really needed? And how can all of that be stewarded? How can all of those fertile conditions be stewarded in deep alignment with life, so that life is able to self-organize, self-integrate with our support, with our participation, but without excess control, just enough control? This is the dance of stewardship, to discern when we really need to take hold of something and when we should allow something to emerge. So those are the core conversations that I invite organizations or systems to take part in, and to identify actions that they can take to step forward into learning about each of those. So we can imagine what would it look like, and then we can imagine how can we step into that future vision in a way that's safe enough to try and safe enough to fail if that is a possibility, but that will generate some good learning and will contribute already in itself to wisdom and healing, that will bring us into more connection. So that's a general description of my work.
But it's so important. It's such an important stage. I think as you're talking, I'm thinking about the community that I recently joined of yours, and I know you're doing some partnership with the Bio Leadership Project, but the OD for Life, Organizational Development for Life, and bringing OD practitioners and HR practitioners, learning and development experts, systems thinkers, all those agents together to think about what's next. Part of my mission in this work that I'm doing is to reach the hearts and minds of HR practitioners. As some people have said, they shouldn't be called HR, human resources, because resources are something you use and manipulate and manage, as opposed to human development experts, let's just say. But having them looking at the future, especially as they're dealing with COVID and all these stressors that the companies are going through, with the Great Recession, to health issues of their employees, to mobility and moving people around, and just trying to sort of get their heads above water. Having to tell them to think about sustainability and the emergent future and regeneration or anything is difficult. But I think these kinds of conversations that you're starting to shape with them, to have them thinking about it, so that as they look for solutions, they're not band-aiding solutions on systems, old ways of thinking that are literally crumbling beneath our feet. Those old systems are dying. And instead looking at what is emerging and what's the new future look like, and how do we solve these issues of today using more forward thinking, consciousness mindsets, et cetera.
Yeah. I think if we approach that conversation thinking in terms of human resources, then it will be a difficult conversation. But if we can shift the thinking a bit, go deeper, and ask, you offered the alternative human development experts. If we can ask, so what are we developing? What exactly are we developing there? In our human development work, in our organizational development, and the word means to unveil, to reveal. What are we revealing? Is it maybe this ability to thrive, and that life that's there that wants to be expressed? So if we come at it from a perspective like that, then we can also see this experience of the pandemic has given so many people permission to think bigger, to see that we need to have really important conversations about what matters. There's the great resignation that the media is talking about, that people aren't willing to do meaningless jobs anymore and potentially put their lives at risk unless it has meaning for them. And there's so much meaningful work that needs to be done. So I'm finding it really encouraging. The last year has made it so much easier to have the conversations that I've been trying to have for 20 years. And I'm hearing that from others who do similar work as well. Yeah, it's actually a really exciting time. It's scary and exciting at the same time.
I know. It's so nice to see, the hard work that you've been doing, and even the hard work of other experts and even sustainability practitioners. I mean, I've been shouting from a soapbox for a couple of decades, and now finally companies, especially through the pressures from ESG and their investors, are starting to say, oh my God, what do we need? What can we do about this? And I think it's important for those companies to not look at ESG as a quick sort of, or sustainability as a quick sort of, one-off kind of initiative to address, and then we'll move on kind of thing. But that even in the context of sustainability, and this is in honor of regeneration, that in the context of sustainability, companies are really looking at how do living systems operate? What is the essence of how living systems operate? And you've done a nice job outlining your 4 principles here that they, are at least 4 things that they should be following, and to be authentically sustainable. And if not, again, like I said, regenerative, there's a lot of terms, but moving in the right direction. Yeah.
There's such a risk of things like ESG and even sustainability being seen as another set of gears that we have to attach to the side of the machine, another checklist. We just need to do this at a superficial level to satisfy the investors and maybe the broader community. And that doesn't get us to wisdom and healing. In fact, it creates burnout and
one more thing.
One
more thing I got to do.
One more thing, exactly. So I'm starting to do more and more work in education, and there are teachers who are saying we need to integrate ecological thinking into the curriculum. How are we not addressing this and teaching this? But universally, teachers are also saying, and administrators, there's no room in the curriculum. It's full. And so the conversation ends there. There's no room in the curriculum within education to address sustaining life on Earth. So we need a bigger conversation than just the sort of one more thing. We need to say, what is the thing? What is what are the principles? What is the purpose of coming together and learning, really?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it starts with awareness. So I think, because the next question is, and the final question for you is, sort of what's next for people? What can they do to start making the change and starting to heal? And I think, I would say I'm going to partially answer that question. One thing is definitely buy your book and read that. And I do think there's a lot of value in how you start the book, as we started this podcast talking about why are we here? How did we develop this mechanistic society and the way that we think, the way we behave, the way we make decisions, the way we treat each other? Because I've grappled with those questions for a long time, and I never really fully understood them until I read your book, and I've read other experts talking about similarly, this sort of crisis of consciousness and this separation from nature, and it's like, wow, okay, now I get it. Now I understand this body that I'm in, and this brain, the way it's working, and why I perceive the world the way I do, or why others do. And as I'm trying to explain why sustainability is important, and getting sort of a blank stare, from them.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. One of the little easy tricks I find to exploring this shift is to pay attention to language, as I've mentioned. So if you find yourself using language from physics or war, pay attention to that and see if there's an alternative. So human resources is kind of extractive and dominating. What if it's just people, human beings, people and culture, something like that? I had a client that saw themselves as an umbrella organization. They were a community group, a transition town group. You might know that movement. Mm-hmm. And they were a little frustrated that people would come. There's my dog. I'm going to walk and let one dog in, one dog out. Okay. So people would come to their transition meetings and get connected and inspired and go off and create some other initiative. And the transition group would be left with kind of nothing to show for it and feel like they were unacknowledged. And I said, what if you shift from thinking of yourself as an umbrella organization for other community initiatives and see yourselves as cultivating fertile soil for community projects? And what does that bring up for you in skills that you might develop and partners that you might reach out to, and just patterns of interaction? So that's kind of a quick, easy little way to start exploring this new worldview. I had another thought as well, and the dogs distracted me. So maybe ask me another question or offer your thoughts, and maybe it'll come back.
Yeah, no, I like you're talking about just starting from a point of language and reframing the way that we look at ourselves and the way we look at the world and what's possible, especially looking at ourselves critically through the eye of this mechanistic society, and finding ways to look at nature and mimic those systems. Biomimicry is something that's fascinated me, and the work that they're doing to use that both for innovating new solutions to help us in all kinds of business and other household goods, etc. But a lot of experts out there doing great work to help organizations shift the way that they think about the world.
And there's such a need for the courage to ask really bold, deep questions about what's really needed. I think I shared with you, I wrote a long piece about tourism recently, but this little snippet is true for anyone, that the situation is so dire. We need every industry, every sector to put down their tools, look up and around at the world and say, these are our skills and resources. How can we help?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and the answer to that is more than the technology. Here's what I was going to share. And this connects to the depth that's needed, and how leaders can show up in this time during the pandemic and increasing tension of the climate crisis and political crisis. What is really needed is showing up with deep presence to life, to the life in the person in front of you, to the life that exists in the relationship between you, to the life that you're embedded within in the ecosystem. This deep presence is needed if we are to be stewards of what is alive and emerging. And in that OD for Life call that you participated in December, I talked about how we naturally, if the circumstances allow it, we naturally have that deep presence to life and what is needed when there is a birth. You know, when my children were newborn and very young, I had no choice but to surrender to deep presence and sensing what is needed now. Is it food? Is it sleep? Is it something else? You know? And then we have that deep presence again when there is dying happening, when we are accompanying someone in dying. And both of those can be experiences that are filled with grace, with deep meaning and aliveness. There is thrivability in accompanying birth and death. And so the big question is, can we bring that in the mundane middle of life to the meeting? You know, can we show up with that level of presence? And so I think that's the real invitation and opportunity for leaders with their staff, with their partners who are struggling. We're all struggling. Can we be present to the struggle and the life and the hope and the despair? That seems to be what's really needed.
And how
to be regenerative, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and how so we'll end with this. So how would leaders, you know, a couple of examples of how they would create? I know you mentioned in your book, you know, the need for practice grounds and creating the space for that. So how would leaders create that space?
Well, first there's that intention, you know, to see that might be the most important work you can do, to be present to what is needed and what's alive. And that includes the work of the organization. This isn't that we all sit in a circle and sing Kumbaya, but how can we bring deep presence to getting stuff done that is really needed and that will be a healing contribution to the world. So seeing that this is the work that's needed, this practice of stewardship and aligning with life, and seeing that our organizations can be really powerful practice grounds for a more thrivable world. And where else is that going to happen? Where else do we have a commons where we come together in modern society to sense what's needed and to collaborate, to make it manifest? We don't have that for most of us in church anymore. We don't have it in a sort of public square, but in our organizations, we have an opportunity to create an intentional, informed, I talk about thrivability as the informed intention and practice. So of aligning with life. So that's the challenge and the opportunity.
Yeah, and it sounds like that would need to be something that's supported from the top, clearly at the C level, and also culturally, you know, eventually sort of creating that culture that enables. And the culture starts with leaders, as we know, to open that up. And again, then all goes back to starting with themselves, practicing that, just being intentional from the beginning.
And it's rooted in conversation, and we have to shift from thinking it's all talk and no action. The talk is part of the action. It's part of the learning. It's part of the adaptability and creativity and resilience. So we have to create space for life. That includes time for life.
Well, thank you, Michelle. It's been a pleasure to talk to you today, and the work you're doing is so important. This is life we're talking about, folks.
What could
Let's
be
get
more
aligned with
important?
it.
Right.
Yeah, get aligned. Thank you again, and really look forward to collaborating with you and this ongoing journey of ours.
Thank you so much. I look forward to it too.
Thanks for being here.